you. And again, thanks for being flexible. We will continue to have the Wednesday schedule for the briefings. Although next month we will not have a briefing because it'll be around 4th of July, and with vacations and things, we won't be having it next month, but we will resume in August on the Wednesday calendar. But like Robin said, we have a conference, the National Council of Nonprofits conference starting tomorrow, so weren't able to have it tomorrow. So there is a lot going on. And Robin, can you put the briefing doc in the chat?
Yep, I just did.
Great. So details are in the briefing doc, but there's two time-sensitive priorities that I'm going to start with first. One that is federal and one that is state. And then we'll touch on a couple of state issues and then go to federal. So normally I do all the federal first and then come to the state, but I want to kind of prioritize our time. So the one is on the state level, the Rhode Island Voting Rights Act. The General Assembly leadership sent out a statement yesterday saying that they are postponing a vote on the bill until the 2027 session. That's not what we want to see. So there is a rally this afternoon at 3:30 in support of the bill. And you can also contact Senate President Lawson and Speaker Blazajewski to urge them to pass the bill this session. I'm putting in the chat information that the Women's Fund sent out about the action step. It is also in the briefing document. But as we have seen voting rights getting chipped away, particularly with the recent Supreme Court decisions in Calais, which is the overarching decision, basically rolling back Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We have seen southern states working at lightning speed to redistrict congressional districts that have Black representation, and to basically try and eliminate those Black representatives from those districts. So people are acting very quickly on what the Supreme Court ruled. So we would really like to see this Rhode Island Voting Rights Act pass this session. We expect the session to end on Friday, so there's not a lot of time left in this session, but making your voice heard does have an impact. So if you can do that, either go to the rally this afternoon at the State House or send a message to Senate President Lawson and Speaker Blazajewski about the importance of passing the Voting Rights Act. That would be great. So that is the state priority right now. The federal priority is that the Office of Management and Budget has released a 400+ page proposed rule that would basically upend the way that federal funding is done and would have really significant impacts to nonprofits who receive or apply for federal funding. So there is a short comment period for this rule. Comments have to be in by July 13th. So normally it's like a 60 to 90 day comment period. This is a shorter one because they are trying to implement this for the beginning of the next federal fiscal year, which would be October 1st. So it is likely that they will not be going through this process very carefully or thoughtfully because they really want to implement it for FY27, which starts in October. So it's really important for us to mobilize really quickly to provide comments. National Council of Nonprofits has a national sign-on letter. So that is a quick and easy way that you can make your voices heard. There is also, NCN also has a comment guide to submit public comment, and you can also email our congressional delegation. We are going to set up an easy email to be able to send to our congressional delegation, who are very helpful on this types of issues. So I'm assuming that they will continue to be helpful, but it is really a regulatory action versus a legislative action. So they have a little less leverage than they would if it were a legislative action. So a couple of, just to give you a sense of some of the things that are in this new proposed rule. There is I'm going to also just put this chart in the chat, which is, this chart is linked in the briefing document. The whole chart isn't in the briefing document, but the link is there. So one thing that the rule intends to do is essentially align all grant making with administration policies and priorities, quote unquote. Basically, they're seeking to do that by putting a political appointee in charge of every federal agency's grant making to be able to ensure that grants aren't going out which conflict with administration policies and priorities. That would give power to that person that is not authorized by Congress. So Congress tells the executive branch, these are the things that we want to fund. This is what congressional priorities and budget says. And this would establish a position in each federal agency that would have the ability to essentially veto that and to direct funding towards projects that are in line with what the administration wants. There would be, there's also a pre-issuance review. So before the decisions are made, the political appointee would be able to reject funding proposals using very vague, non-transparent criteria, could be rejected before the actual decision process. So that would mean that and it wouldn't be transparent. So you wouldn't know why your proposal was denied because the decisions would be made not on a public rubric or something like that. Also, because it would prioritize presidential policy priorities and what they call the national interest, quote unquote, it would create this boomerang of grant funding just moving back and forth and being canceled and terminated and reinstated with different administrations. So it would be really difficult for grantees to have confidence about what is coming in the future because everything could get upended with every new administration. It also says that they would not fund quote unquote anti-American programs, which would include things that this administration is not in favor of. So it could throw into question, again, things that they're already questioning: DEI, gender, public safety, immigration, things like that, which I would argue are American or should be American values, but that they consider anti-American values. They also are going to look to uh, evaluate whether applicants have done things in the past that are questionable practices or apply to national security, which is not defined. So again, it could be things could be proposals could be thrown out because they are perceived as supporting things that the particular administration is not interested in. It would also give the ability to cancel and terminate grants basically for any reason. And so that is not the way you want to run your nonprofit, of not knowing if the federal grant you received is actually going to be available to you for the whole duration of the grant, because it could be terminated at any point and there wouldn't be an appeal process. So in other words, it's bad. It will definitely be litigated, but there can't be litigation until the actual rule is implemented. So, but for that litigation, it's really important to get as many comments as possible, because one of the factors in litigation is that federal agencies are legally required to read through and respond to every comment. And so if they receive thousands and thousands and thousands of comments, but they still follow this really fast timeline, it'll be clear that they didn't actually read through every comment and respond to every comment. So number one, just the sheer numbers matters about comments. But then also, if there are particular issues that are of significance to your organization, it's important to identify those specific things so that it can boost future litigation and arguments that are going to be made by the litigator. So it's really important to have you weigh in on this. It can be intimidating to submit public comments, but like I said, National Council of Nonprofits has a comment guide, so you can use that. You can also sign on to the national letter. And as you know, it is legal for nonprofits to advocate on different things. But in addition, comments on regulations are not considered advocacy or lobbying. So it doesn't even count towards your quota of advocacy, but it is incredibly important. So please, 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 if you can, sign on to the national letter, submit comments, and encourage others to do the same. Like I said, we will have a UJoin link for emailing our congressional delegation, and we will send that out in the newsletter, but we don't have that up just yet. So any questions about that? Okay. It is really bad, and we do need to weigh in on it. So just to also articulate, last month I talked about the SAM.gov certification requirements, which essentially are an end around the federal government wanting to, they have been losing court cases about putting certification requirements onto individual grants. So putting the certification process into the SAM.gov registration would be an end around. That proposal got 15,000 comments in the first comment period. It will be having an additional comment period this summer, which we will let you know about. But that is separate from this OMB regulation. So we will be asking you for comments both for this OMB issue, as well as a second round of comments for the SAM.gov requirement. Laureen.
I just want to add to that, if I can, that I can't claim to have read them closely because it's a monster, but the conditions that we lost our federal grants under fall in there, and what's proposed lets them take these actions, gives a justification for them taking these actions to existing grants and contracts. So it wouldn't affect just things going forward. It would
Right.
be a license for them to do what they've been doing with cancellations on a legal basis, I guess.
Yeah. And do you want, since you're on, do you want to just mention about your court case?
Okay. Hate to think of it as mine personally. Um, yeah, but we did have two federal NPD grants from the U.S. Department of Ed that were non-continued because we were anti-American. And that stemmed from the fact that literally verbatim that we used the term social justice in one of our course descriptions in our application 5 years ago. Um, but we have been working with the Lawyers Committee for Rhode Island. Amazing, amazing resource if you don't know them, and the Southern Poverty Law Center on filing a lawsuit challenging the legality of canceling those. I believe there were 28 grants across the country, thousands of teachers. They just shut off their program funding midstream. And the lawsuit was filed in Rhode Island. Um, Tuesday or Wednesday this last week. So it's just gone in. The National Education Association is the lead plaintiff on it. There's hundreds of teachers that are involved. So we're proud and happy to be part of it, and a little intimidated as well. But when I saw this, I was like, yeah, here's the justification for doing what you did illegally. So.
Thank you so much for stepping forward. There's others on the call who have been on other lawsuits. It takes a lot of courage to do this, and Rhode Island is the bravest state in the country because this is where lots of these um, cases are taking place, partially because we have the lawyers committee who's willing to um, be bold and fearless and take on the administration, but also because we have nonprofits that are willing to step up. And it's risky and it's not an easy decision, but really grateful for that. We also just had, there's another case where Dorcas International and Refugee Dream Center were two of the lead plaintiffs on an immigration case that I didn't actually include in here. I should revise that. But they were contesting the after the shooting in Washington D.C. of the National Guard members by an Afghan immigrant. The federal government instituted they have 39 or 37 countries on a travel ban, and they put a hold on any immigration action for anyone in any of those 37, 39 countries. So whether that was someone who needed to renew their work permit or someone who was on the verge of becoming a citizen or getting a green card, they were just put on hold indefinitely for all of those things because of the actions of this one individual in DC. And so lawyers committee, so both Dorcas and Refugee Dream Center help folks with their immigration paperwork and processing. And so they had all these folks from these countries who are left in limbo and lose their jobs because they don't have the work permit or have other really stressful life implications of this. And so lawyers committee went to court and was successful in the district court here ruled that all of those policies were illegal and needed to be rescinded. So that means that though that anybody across the country who was impacted by those policies no longer is impacted by those policies. The federal government is going to appeal, but again, it's Rhode Island nonprofits stepping up to make a huge impact for folks across the country. And so just again, want to say thank you to the folks on this call and the folks from other parts of Rhode Island who have stepped up to be plaintiffs in these cases. So it's unclear as to whether the holds have been lifted on the immigrants from those 39 countries, but by order of the court, they should have been by now. And so we're going to be watching to see if those holds on the immigration processing takes effect, because that was the result of the court case. So thank you, Lorraine, for sharing about your case as well. And the evergreen reminder that if you have any issue related to any federal regulation, contract, grant, if something comes up, your first call should be to the lawyers committee or to me, and I can connect you with the lawyers committee, because they continue to be amazing advocates and fighters for us. So please let me know. Any questions on those lawsuits? There also was another lawsuit that the lawyers committee did on behalf of the Rhode Island Child Advocate, because the administration was asking for the medical records of children who had received gender affirming care at Rhode Island Hospital. And they won that decision in the district court. It's been stayed at the circuit court level, so it's kind of in flux right now. So Rhode Island Hospital has provided some anonymized data to the judge, not to the federal government. A judge in Texas, it's a long story, but not to the federal government yet, as the rest of it is litigated. But they were successful at the district court level here, and now they're waiting because the federal government's appealing. So any questions about any of those? All right. Two other things on the state level. One is that I mentioned in the last call that some nonprofits have received a notification from QuickBooks that with a notification from the Rhode Island Division of Taxation that they needed to provide 1099 forms for any income over $100. And they needed to do it retroactive to tax year 2025. Now, this notice was received by the nonprofits I talked to at the end of March. Most people already filed their taxes by the end of March. And, a January 2024 incentive that you gave, a 2025 incentive that you gave, keeping all those records and going back to the person and asking them for all of their federal information is a big headache. We were working with the Rhode Island Society of CPAs, who also wanted to push back on this. Rhode Island Small Business Coalition also wanted to push back on this. So there was a bill introduced last week in the House that would align the state requirement for 1099s with the federal requirement for 1099s, which makes sense. Seems like that should be the case. It was heard in House Finance last week. A number of nonprofits submitted letter testimony and support, which was great. And there needed to be an amendment to it, just a technical amendment. The code reference, the IRS code needed to be added. So that amended bill is being heard and voted on today in House Finance. The amended bill is also being heard and potentially voted on in Senate Finance today. Because they've been introduced so quickly and are getting votes, I think they have the General Assembly leadership behind it. So I would not be surprised if, even though there's only a couple days to the end of session, that bill makes it over the finish line, which would be really good for nonprofits who may be doing, small incentives for participation in your programs, and or helping someone with, a few expenses so they can participate in something that from now on, if it passes, you would not have to provide a 1099 until they reach the federal threshold, which I believe has gone up to $2,000. So we will keep you posted on that, but that's good news, and it does seem like it has a good chance of crossing the finish line. The other thing that I had mentioned last month was that there's an increasing interest on nonprofit property tax exemptions. And Representative Slater had proposed a bill to have a study commission of the state statute. That does not seem like it's going to pass this session, but there was a court case which was just resolved in the last month between PACE, the nonprofit PACE, and the city of East Providence, where the nonprofit said that they should be tax exempt, and the city said that they were not tax exempt and were not property tax exempt. And they went to court, and the court ruled that they did have to pay the taxes. The reason was because the the state statute was ambiguous. And so I would argue that it actually, in PACE's, the statute is definitely ambiguous, but I would argue that it was not ambiguous in PACE's case, but I'm not a lawyer, and so I can't really speak to that. But it is an argument for why we do need to have a study commission to look at the state statute, so that we can improve it and we don't have cases thrown out of court because the statute is ambiguous. So that is something that we'll look for next year's session. Providence moved forward with their nonprofit property tax exemption work group, and they will be proposing some recommendations to the mayor and the city council in the next couple of weeks. I was part of that work group, and I think that most of the things that they're proposing are fairly common sense about standardizing that decision-making process, making it more transparent. I was able to advocate to make some changes to make it a more acceptable for nonprofits, but that should be, I think they're finalizing what they're doing, and should be released in the next couple of weeks. So that's kind of where things stand on property tax exemption. Any questions on that? Okay, so jumping back to federal, the Senate passed the second budget reconciliation bill of the year, and it was focused on immigration enforcement and border security. There was a lot of back and forth about whether it would include the ballroom, whether it would prohibit the slush fund that Trump has proposed. It's basically just really narrow at this point. But they are also looking at potentially a third reconciliation bill, later this summer. It's not a slam dunk that it will happen, but there is a potential of a third reconciliation bill that would include potentially changes to federal election law, potentially some further cuts to safety net programs. And so we are obviously going to be monitoring that with National Council of Nonprofits to make sure that nonprofits are protected and that the important programs that you all work on are protected. The appropriations process is still, the regular appropriations process is still continuing. The Labor, Health, and Human Services bill passed out of the subcommittee, and they're expecting to vote on it this week, the full committee to vote on it this week. That is funding that impacts a lot of you all. They also, Senate appropriators postponed planned markups of commerce, justice, and science, and agricultural, and the FDA. When I talked to folks in Senator Reid's office, they thought there's only a tiny chance that an actual full year appropriations budget passes in normal order. Basically, they are counting on having a continuing resolution because, number one, they haven't had a regular budget pass in the last 4, 5, 10 years. And so it's highly unlikely for that reason. Also, basically, they want to kick the can down the road till after the elections. So basically, the expectation is that there would be a continuing resolution that would cover at least through the election, and then they would be making decisions whether they're going to do something lame duck, which is still unlikely, or whether they would wait for the new Congress to do something for the actual appropriations process. The Senator Collins, who is the chair of the Senate Appropriations Committee, does want to go through regular order, so she is going to try, but tabling some of these bills shows that it's not necessarily going to be an easy effort to try and get them through. There are continued conversations in the Senate about whether there are ways to delay the HR 1 proposed SNAP cost shifts. So we've already seen the implementation of the SNAP work requirements, but in HR 1, there's also the implementation of the states having to pick up more of the cost of SNAP, the SNAP program, SNAP administrative costs, those kinds of things. And so the Senate has been debating whether there are ways to delay that, the implementation of that, but there is no consensus around that. There are some Republicans who are open to considering an extension, but in order to allow states to do some planning and put some mechanisms in place for that. But under HR 1, the state has until September to reduce their FY26 SNAP error rates, which determines the SNAP error rates determine the amount of the cost share for the state of the SNAP. So it is really important to get that error rate down, but it is really difficult when they have to come up with new software and new technology and new outreach and communication and all these kinds of things. And so the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities showed that in just 12 states, over 700,000 children have transitioned off the program since July of last year. So that's like 750,000 kids who are no longer on SNAP. in these states that were implementing changes earlier. So there is a action step you can take if you want to send a message to Congress to extend the delay of the cost share. There are a bunch of investigations that are happening on the congressional level. There's a new task force, which I think had just been announced when we met last month. It is chaired by someone who is not very nonprofit friendly and has talked about wanting to defend constitutional rights in the face of institutions that work to abuse and undermine historic pillars of American government and society, including illegal DEI policy, the abuse of immigration and social welfare programs, and efforts by foreign actors and dark money groups to suppress Americans' free speech. So we're not anticipating good things coming out of that committee, but just there's another committee that is looking for information for nonprofits that have foreign ties. There's another congressional hearing was on environmental nonprofits, and they argued that they were abusing litigation in order to get settlement money. There's also a hearing on the Southern Poverty Law Center. In the Southern Poverty Law Center has been indicted by the administration for fraud. Basically, say the government is arguing that the Southern Poverty Law Center told donors that they were fighting racism at the same time that they were paying confidential informants within racist organizations. And so therefore they were actually funding racism. And so that's a fraud on donors because they were actually the donors behind the KKK, which, yeah, it's bad. So that is concerning in and of itself, kind of the weaponization and false accusations against the nonprofit. In addition, there are a number of donor platforms and donor advised fund programs that have turned off giving to the Southern Poverty Law Center in response to this. And so there was a congressional letter, a Democratic Attorney General letter sent to Fidelity, Vanguard, and Schwab with concerns about them turning off the ability for Southern Poverty Law Center to continue to get donations through their platforms. There are a bunch of anti-fraud pieces of legislation, some of which would impact nonprofits. So we'll keep you posted on those as well. There are a couple of good things. One is that there was a letter from the Democratic senators and representatives to rescind the harmful public service loan forgiveness regulations that were implemented last year. And we had good representation from Rhode Island's congressional delegation on that. There is a lawsuit on that National Council of Nonprofits is contesting those regulations. There's also a bipartisan Charity Parity Act, which would give nonprofits the same credit for any expenses to set up a retirement savings plan that for-profit companies get. So that is a good bill. There's also a Protecting Charitable Giving Act, which would increase the penalty for disclosing donor information. That's a good bill. And then there are a couple of bills. Then there's also the Department of Education has a new workforce Pell Grant program. So we know about Pell Grants that are used in higher ed. This is a Pell Grant Pell Grant initiative for workforce development programs. So that's a good thing. Let's see. There's a number of other things about fraud investigations that are in there that are being done on the executive branch side. And there is also the Medicaid interim final rule for HR 1 has been released. So HR 1 said there's going to be work requirements for folks on SNAP and Medicaid. SNAP has already been implemented, and now the Medicaid requirements have come out. So we will be doing some training on those work requirements for nonprofits. It impacts you in two ways. One is that there are probably people that you work with who are impacted by the new requirements. There are also probably people you work with who don't know whether they are impacted, but are hearing about that and are going to come to you with questions about, is this me? Am I going to get kicked off Medicaid? We want you to have the information of where to send them and an understanding of who is impacted. So we'll have that. The second is that volunteering at a nonprofit, a 501c3 nonprofit, can count as fulfilling work requirement hours. So we know that lots of folks may have difficulty getting enough hours. If you're working a low-wage job at a fast food restaurant, your schedule varies. You may only be able to get 10 hours a week. You need to have 20 hours a week. Volunteer roles can help fill that requirement. So we will also have a training on what nonprofits need to know about documentation for volunteers who are either need the volunteering for SNAP work requirements or for Medicaid work requirements. So look for that coming soon. We will have information about how you can participate in that. And then in terms of litigation, there continue to be good decisions happening at the district court level. There's a bunch of good decisions that are listed in the briefing document. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there are good things that are happening there. There are, at the end of the briefing document, there is information about the USDA finally released the FY24 SNAP Household Characteristics Report. So it's the most up-to-date we have. It's not that up-to-date, but just so that in case you want to access that, there's a link to it. And then there's a list of different policies that have comment periods right now. So the HUD rules around equal access, so kind of the disparity issue, that rule, the public comment is until June 29th. There's also one replacing references to gender identity and sexual orientation with the word sex for HUD housing programs. The comments are due on the 29th. There's updates to the child support income withholding form that you can submit comments for. There's SNAP quality control worksheets. You can submit comments. Medicaid provider payments tied to Medicaid rates, and joint employer liability, which is basically when you have federal wage and overtime laws and someone works at two different employers, like who carries the day essentially on that liability. So there are those opportunities with links to submit comments if those are programs or regulations that would impact your organization. But the most important is the OMB regulation. And you can sign on to the sign-on letter as well as submit comments. And we will also have a UJoin link to send information to our congressional delegation. So, any questions on all of that? Okay, well then you can get 15 minutes back in your day. Again, just a reminder, next month we will not have a briefing. We'll have it in August, back on a Wednesday. And please, again, reach out if you encounter issues in any of your federal grants or issues at the state level. I didn't know about the 1099 issue until a nonprofit reached out to me and said, we're having this issue. And so we're able to get the ball rolling, and hopefully, fingers crossed, that will get over the finish line by the end of this week. But there's still time to weigh in on the Voting Rights Act to try and get that one over the line as well. Thank you so much.